Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Welcome to today's reading from Brilliant as the Sun, a retelling of Srimad Bhagavatam Canto 4. We're going to begin Chapter 8, Child Dhruva Goes to the Forest. Maitreya describes the origin of all inauspicious qualities. He then narrates the history of Prince Dhruva, who was insulted at a tender age by his stepmother and father. On his mother's advice, Dhruva seeks out Lord Vishnu to ask him for a boon. The sun was dropping toward the western horizon. Parikshit looked over the placid waters of the Ganges, where small fishing boats slowly made their way toward shore. He sat in silent thought, reflecting on Shukadev's words. Daksha had offended Shiva out of arrogance. He had offended Shamik in the forest in the same way. The king covered his face with his hands and bowed his head. So exactly how we feel sometimes when we hear about something and it reminds us that actually we are not much better, but because we have behaved in a similar way in the past. Are you well? Asked Shukadev. Parikshit looked up. How kind was the Lord. He showed mercy even to grievous offenders. We need only feel repentant. With folded palms, he addressed Shukadev. I am more than well, great sage. You are mercifully purifying my heart with these divine recitations. If it so pleases you, pray tell me what else transpired between those great souls, Maitreya and Vidur. Listen, dear king, replied Shukadev. In the dim light of early dawn, Vidur made his way to the nearby lake and dipped into the cool water. On nearby grassy knoll, he saw Maitreya seated, absorbed in meditation. After bathing, Vidur sat near him and quietly chanted Krishna's names. When Maitreya's body was warmed up by the rising sun, he fully opened his half-closed eyes and smiled at his friend. Shall we resume? Maitreya said, Shall we resume? Certainly, said Vidur. I am eager to know how the creation unfolded. Pray tell me, did any of Brahma's other sons have progeny? Verses 1 and 2, Maitreya said, many of Brahma's sons never married, preferring to remain lifelong celibates. These included the 4 Kumars, brothers headed by Sanak, Narad, Ribhu, Hamsa, Aruni and Yati. So these sons of Brahmaji, they decided to remain celibate in their lives. There was a demonic lineage descending from Brahma that I think you will find fascinating. Now this is interesting. We're going to read about a demonic lineage descending from Brahma. He had a son named Irreligion and a daughter named Falsity. Falsity or Falsity, Falsity. They had an incestuous relationship from which came another boy and girl, bluffing and cheating. These 2 children were raised by a childless demon named Niritti. Verses 3 to 5, from the incestuous union of bluffing and cheating came a boy and girl named Greed and Cunning. From their union were born anger and envy, whose union produced quarrel and profanity. Their union produced death and fear, who in turn gave birth to pain and hell. A pious and faithful person can guard himself from the devastating influence of these personalities by carefully studying their lineage at least 3 times. Verses 6 to 8 now. Now, O best of the Kuru dynasty, let us return to Swambhuva Manu's descendants, among whom are several incarnations of Vishnu. By his wife Shatrupa, he had 2 sons named Uttanpad and Priyavrat. Both were competent to rule the universe and protect the citizens because they were empowered incarnations of Vasudev, a plenary expansion of Krishna. The youngest son was King Uttanpad, who had two queens, Suniti, the mother of a boy named Dhruva, and Suruchi, his favorite. So Suruchi was the favorite of the king Uttanpad, the favorite queen of the king Uttanpad, and his other queen Suniti, she was the mother of Dhruva Maharaj. As we read about him, we are actually reading about him in this chapter. Verse 9, King Uttanpad sat on a splendid throne surrounded by courtiers and ministers. Queen Suruchi sat beside him, watching as he played with their son Uttam. The king bounced baby Uttam gently on his lap, laughing to hear the infant squeal with delight. Uttam's older brother Dhruva wanted to join in the fun. He stood on his toes, reaching up to his father's knees, and tried to pull himself up. He tried repeatedly, but without success. Daddy, I want to play too, he pleaded. The king, however, ignored him and brushed his little grasping hands away. Verse 10, Dhruva ran to the chief minister who stood nearby. Help me up, he demanded, pulling on the minister's dhoti. The minister looked straight ahead, ignoring the boy. Without the king's order, he could do nothing. Dhruva tried again. Grabbing the minister's hands, he tried to pull him toward the throne. Help me up. Suruchi's bosom heaved with annoyance. Her voice boomed out loudly. Verse 11. Little boy, you are not allowed to sit either on the throne or on the king's lap. Dhruva looked up in surprise at her scolding face. He's my daddy. Yes, but I'm not your mummy, so I forbid you. Dhruva's large eyes began to tear. You are my mummy. Verse 12. Suruchi huffed. I know you call me mummy, but another woman actually gave you birth, so stop trying to join my son on the king's lap. Without my permission, it's not possible. King Uttanpad winced but said nothing. Dhruva ran to his father and tried again to clamber onto his knee. Queen Suruchi pushed his hand away. Verse 13, if you want to sit on the king's lap, here is my advice. Perform severe austerities to please Narayan and ask the Lord that you may take your next birth from my womb. Now run along and do not bother us anymore. Verse 14, Dhruva's flushed face turned up to the king. Surely his father would stand up for him. To the boy's dismay, Uttanpad did not even look at him. Dhruva began to breathe heavily, like a snake struck by a stick. He turned and ran away from the court. Wait till I tell my mummy. Verse 15. Dhruva ran toward his mother's room, wailing hysterically, followed by his two nurses. Suniti jumped from her couch as the crying got nearer. That's Dhruva. She rushed out of her room with her maids hurrying behind her. Dhruva was scrambling up the stairs. Suniti lifted him into her arms and stroked his hot forehead. It's okay, my child, it's okay. She cradled him in her arms and returned to her room, where she sat, her trembling son on her lap. Tell me what's wrong, my darling boy. Dhruva sobbed feverishly. Unable to speak, his nurses ran in behind him, out of breath. Suniti turned to him. What has happened to the child? They looked up at each other. How could they tell her? Suniti pressed him until he related everything that had occurred. On hearing how cruelly Suruchi had treated Dhruva and how his father had stayed silent, Suniti wept. Verse 16. How could she have spoken so harshly to such a small child? Tears flowed from her eyes and her face turned bright red. Verse 17. She looked up at her maidservants. What should I do? They shook their heads sadly. What could she do? Suruchi was supported by the king. Dhruva wiped his eyes with his clenched fist. I'll throw Throw her out, mommy. Suniti pulled him closer. My dear son, do not wish anyone harm. Those who inflict suffering on others will suffer the same pain. Verses 18 and 19. She rocked him gently on her lap, her cheek resting on the crown of his head and her tears wetting his hair. My dear boy, Suruchi is right. It is your great misfortune to have taken birth from me. The king is ashamed to accept me even as his maidservant, never mind his wife. Dear Dhruva, I know your stepmother's words sounded spiteful, but she spoke the truth. If you want to sit on the throne like Uttam, the only solution is to follow her advice and worship Lord Narayan. Dhruva lifted his head, but mummy, she said, by worshipping Lord Narayan, I could take birth from her. I don't want her to be her son. She is horrible. Verse 20, Suniti smiled. By worshipping Narayan, you can achieve anything. By such worship, your great-grandfather, Lord Brahma, became qualified to create the universe. Even great yogis who have controlled their minds and life air worship Narayan. Your grandfather, Swambhuva Manu, also performed great sacrifice and distributed charity in order to satisfy Narayan. He thus achieved the greatest material happiness and at the end of his life went back to the spiritual world. No other deity can give such a result. Verse 22, my dear son, after being insulted by your stepmother, you have come crying to me. Unfortunately, I am unable to help you. Lord Narayan, however, is more kind than millions of mothers. Go to him, for he is always most affectionate and tender in his dealings with his devotees. Even those aspiring for liberation take shelter of him by following severe vows. Dhruva's face set in a serious expression. What vows must I follow? You are too young to follow difficult vows, my son. You need simply always think of him with faith and devotion. This yoga of devotion is easy even for a young child like you. I do not want liberation or devotion, mother. I want a kingdom greater than father's. Maybe I should worship the goddess of fortune. Verse 23, Suniti waved her finger. My dear son, as far as I am concerned, I do not think anyone other than the Supreme Lord Narayan can permanently remove your distress. I know that even highly placed gods like Brahma seek benedictions from the goddess of fortune, but she is always eager to serve Narayan. Verse 24, Dhruva looked up at the paintings of Vishnu which decorated his mother's apartment. She loved him more than anyone and surely wanted his success. He would follow her advice. The boy dried his face with his hands and gave his mother a hug. He lowered himself from her lap and walked from one painting to another. Suniti watched him for a few moments. Thankfully, he seemed to have calmed down. The queen heaved a deep sigh. How painful it was to hear how he had suffered at Suruchi's hands. But what could she do? The king hardly gave her any attention at all. She asked Dhruva to join her when he was finished looking at the paintings and then retired to her room, followed by her anxious attendants, including Dhruva's nurses. All the ladies were greatly distressed by recent events and they needed to vent their grief out of Dhruva's earshot. Dhruva carefully examined the images of Narayan. In some, he was depicted with the goddess of fortune in the spiritual world. In others, he was portrayed in his form as Vishnu riding on Garud, offering benedictions to his austerities in the forest. Perhaps he should also do the same. That seemed the best way to please the Lord. Without further thought, he left his mother's apartment unnoticed and unseen by the guards. He ran out of the palace compound toward the nearby forest. Verses 25 to 26 now. From within Dhruva's heart, Vishnu noted Dhruva's strong determination to engage in his loving devotional service. He informed the sage Narad, inspiring him to go immediately and help Dhruva. Learning of Dhruva's resolve, Narad was astonished. How could such a young child leave his family home and enter the forest alone? Then he found Dhruva. It was almost dark. The boy sat fearlessly under a tree, imitating the devotees he had seen in the paintings. He sat cross-legged with his eyes closed, trying to meditate. Narad watched him for a few minutes. How amazing was the warrior's spirit. They were unable to tolerate even a slight insult. So this is how the warriors or the kshatriyas were, that even at a tender age, that little child, he couldn't tolerate a little insult coming from his stepmother and father. The sage gently stroked the boy's head. Dhruva snapped open his eyes. He immediately recognized the famous sage with his black deerskin, golden hair and golden veena. He fell flat in obeisance and then stood with folded hands, as he had seen his father do when Narad visited the royal court. Verse 27, Narad smiled, "My dear Dhruva, you are only a small boy. You should be playing sports and other light-hearted games. Why are you so upset about being dishonored? Children are frequently chided. Do not take it too seriously." Dhruva's feathers were set in firm lines. Features were set in firm lines. "I am a prince and the queen insulted me in the court." Verse 28 to 29, Narad knelt down next to Dhruva. "Dear boy, I can see you are mature for your age. You understand things that other children may find difficult, so please try to understand that even if your honor was insulted, it is no reason to become upset." Dhruva's expression did not change. "Listen," continued Narad, "there is no need to be angry with your stepmother or father. Honor and dishonor come as a result of our acts in past lives. The reactions to our own deeds are the sole reason for our sufferings and enjoyment. This is the Lord's arrangement. Knowing this, an intelligent person remains peaceful in all circumstances." So I will continue from here onwards next time. And what a beautiful realization Naradji has given to Dhruva and actually to all of us, the listeners, that there is the reactions, that the honor and dishonor come as a result of our acts in past lives. The reaction to our own deeds are the sole reason for our suffering and enjoyment. And if we understand whatever we are going through in our present lives is due to the actions or the karma of our last lives, which we don't remember at all now, and that is a very good thing actually. And how do we react to our own deeds? That is the sole reason for our suffering and enjoyment. So let us remember to keep Krishna in the center of our lives and to live our lives in such a way that we don't accrue any bad karma, at least once we have understood the law of karma and we have heard Bhagavad Gita, Lord's instructions, and now we are reading in Bhagavatam how the devotees, they led their lives to go back to Godhead. We will make mistakes, but we have to try our best to learn from our mistakes and to understand from the teachings of Srimad Bhagavatam, which are so nicely described here by His Grace Krishna Dharma Prabhu and Her Grace Chintamani Dham Mataji, so nicely in simple language, which is easy for us to understand. The realizations are given in such a beautiful narrative for us to understand and imbibe in our lives. So thank you for joining, and I wish you all a very happy Krishna conscious week ahead. Chant and be happy. Hari Om Tat Sat. Hare Krishna.